No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace.
Today is beautiful. Today is really beautiful. But last night was really just uncalled for.
Can we stop the violence and come together and be peaceful?
We're currently on the corner of Pennsylvania Avenue and West North at the scene where the infamous CVS was burning last night through much of the footage.
So I think everyone's expectations should be low and no one should be angry. The family is not going to be upset if new and striking details don't emerge tomorrow or Saturday or Sunday. At some point they will, and we're prepared to be patient. And we ask everyone else in the community, please be patient.
The death of Freddie Gray in April of this year sparked protests throughout the entire city of Baltimore. Hard to forget the images of those riots. The city was forced to declare a state of emergency in the face of the mobs and the violence. As you remember, Freddie Gray died after slipping into a coma due to spine and neck injuries sustained during an arrest. Then, witness videos added fuel to that fire. In May, we learned his death was indeed a homicide, and 6 officers are now facing criminal charges for his death. Yesterday, a judge declared a mistrial in the case of Officer William Porter, one of the 6 police officers charged with Freddie Gray's death. Back with me today is forensic criminologist and police expert Dr. Ron Martinelli. Dr. Martinelli, thanks for being here today. It's great to have you back.
No problem, Liz. Happy to be here.
So there we have it. The first trial in the Freddie Gray case was declared a mistrial. What happened here with Officer William Porter?
Well, I think it's obvious. The prosecution wasn't able to establish their burden of proof beyond a reasonable guilt. I think the forensic evidence did not necessarily harm the officer, and I think there was real questions in the jury's mind as to actually whether a homicide in fact did occur.
Okay, what do you expect to happen here going forward with William Porter?
Well, I think that the prosecution is all in right now. They've already postured a lot, I think, inappropriately, and now they're going to have to make the decision of whether they want to have make another plea offer for a lesser charge, whether they want to re-prosecute, or whether they want to drop charges and maybe have the federal government come in with the United States Department of Justice, somewhat like what they did in the Rodney King case in the early 90s.
All right, let's back up here for a moment and touch on something that you just said. I think a lot of people are still confused on what exactly happened that led to Freddie Gray's death. Was he murdered?
Well, first of all, let's try to get something straight chronologically. Mr. Gray was not injured during the course of a law enforcement encounter or arrest. In fact, after the foot pursuit and the police, arrested him, he was handcuffed. There was no evidence whatsoever of any trauma to his body that would have been force-related. The injury of note occurred during a subsequent transportation of Mr. Gray to the jail. And that's where this head and spinal injury occurred. The nature and the circumstances as to how it occurred, I think, provides the jury with a significant amount of reasonable doubt.
Right, and you and I have talked about before the psychological aspect of these situations. And like you said, there are reports that Freddie Gray was banging his head voluntarily against the van and that he may have sustained those injuries by banging his head on an exposed bolt. Why would he be doing that in the first place?
Well, I think if you take a look, and we have only a brief glimpse of the autopsy report, and it's very interesting that the prosecution tried to hold as much of that evidence as possible away from the general public. And this is because the toxicology report and even the forensic autopsy did not necessarily help the prosecution. With regards to the toxicology, you see that it was shown that Mr. Gray was under the influence of opiates and also cannabinoids. Now, let's take that a step farther. Both the opiates and the cannabinoids are known as depressants. However, I don't have any evidence that the medical examiner's office did what's called a secondary tox screen using a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer. That's called the GMS. It's a big fancy forensic term for basically a device that can look more carefully at the toxicology evidence. It might might be, in fact, that Mr. Gray was under the influence of a synthetic cannabinoid, which is a very powerful stimulant, something like bath salts or K2 or spice or something like that. That would reconcile with the circumstances and the statements that he was agitated and banging his head around in the van. Quite possibly could have banged his head backwards into that exposed bolt to create that mechanism of injury that ultimately caused his death.
Now, is this something that the jurors, this trial, will be investigating, or are they only investigating the actions of the police officers?
Well, no, they have to look at what's referred to as the totality of circumstances. And of course, part of that, a major part of that, is what the actions of the involved officers were. However, they also need to take a look at what Mr. Gray could have done to himself, because ultimately the trier of fact has to look at what is not only inculpatory, but what is exculpatory or perhaps accidental or innocent behavior.
Now, given this declaration of a mistrial by the judge, what do you expect for the 5 other officers charged in this case?
Well, I think the evidence that they had against Officer Porter was probably what they thought was the most damaging evidence, and I think that's why they brought Porter to trial first. I think the charges against the other officers are going to be hard for them to prove. I mean, if they get a mistrial with Porter, then the other officers, which they have less evidence against, what's going to happen with these officers? So the question is, do they go to trial? Do they try to offer them, a lesser charge and hope that they're going to plea bargain? What exactly are they going to go on? Because they really did get their tail feathers singed on this one.
All right, let's switch topics for a moment. Let's talk about the neighbor of Saeed Farouk. And Saeed Farouk, as you remember, is the terrorist who killed 14 people in the San Bernardino attacks. His neighbor, Enrique Marquez, was arrested this morning on charges of supporting terrorism after purchasing the rifles used in these attacks. What are your thoughts on this arrest?
Well, this is a big deal for Mr. Marquez, and this is probably why he's with the FBI, and he's been, if he's smart, he'll sing like a canary, because what they could really charge him for is aiding and abetting a terrorist act. In other words, when you do a straw purchase of weapons, and that's basically what he did. He bought those weapons representing that he was going to be the owner of those weapons, and then without telling anybody or registering those weapons or having the terrorists register those weapons, which the female certainly couldn't do, they used those weapons to commit a very serious terrorist act, 14 homicides, lots of people injured. Those all become part and parcel of homicide charges that the prosecutors could file against Marquez. So not only the straw purchasing, the aiding and abetting, but actually being a principal in a terrorist act that led ultimately to the deaths of 14 people and lots of other people's injured. He could spend the rest of his life in prison without a doubt.
Now, like you said, it's very possible that he may sing like a canary. He may turn over all the information that he has to authorities in order to reduce his sentence. In your opinion, would that significantly reduce his time in prison? Will he be able to provide enough information and cut a deal significant enough with authorities that he won't spend a significant amount of time in jail? Well,
boy, I wish I could get inside the mind of the prosecutors, but I certainly can't do that. What I can tell you is they classically offer a reduction in time for cooperation, but make no mistake about it. He's an identified terrorist. He's been radicalized himself, came out of the same mosque that the other 2 terrorists did. They are going to want to know what was going on in that mosque, and they're going to want to know about any sleeper cells that he's discussed in the Los Angeles or Southern California area that could commit further acts of terrorism in the future.
Right, I'm glad you brought that up about the sleeper cells. Do you have any expectation that his interrogations or the information he provides will lead to any more arrests or any more terror cells in this area?
It just depends on what his psychological makeup is. If he's a person that's scared of spending the rest of the time in prison, he may very well give the FBI the information that they need to further their investigations, to identify further terrorists and try to thwart other acts of terrorism. If he's, sort of a down for the hood, so to speak, radicalized terrorist and believes in martyrdom, he may not give them that much information whatsoever, and including that, he might give them deceptive information.
Right. It's going to be a very tricky thing, I would think, for them to decide whether it's more dangerous for them not to get information for him and to maybe let him go free sooner, or whether it's more dangerous for him to spend the rest of his life in prison but not know the information. Dr. Martinelli, we are out of time, but I appreciate you coming on the program today.
Thank you so much, Liz. Good to be here.
Today marks 1 year since President Obama's announcement to reopen relations with the communist nation of Cuba. But where's this left us? Find out after the break.